There was a clear bullet hole on the right side of his temple. Next to him is an unknown person, and I can just see the blood pouring out of his head. Just the worst thing I've ever seen.
A shocking double murder in a small-town funeral home.
It'd been 25 years since we had a homicide. This was something totally new to us. We weren't expecting it.
Was the person paranoid and thought an affair was going on?
A list of suspects, both radical and unusual.
Sometimes people have very extreme beliefs, and that can lead to violence.
The only person that would know this information is the shooter. That is our killer.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Bordering the scenic St. Croix River.
Hudson's a small bedroom community. It's kind of a town where everybody knows everybody. People are comfortable with leaving their cars unlocked. They're comfortable with leaving their doors open.
Hudson is also home to the annual Pepper Fest.
In the 1950s, there was a large Italian population, and that was the origin of the Pepper Fest.
There's a pepper eating contest, pound of peppers, and if you can do it in about 10 to 15 seconds, you're doing pretty good.
But on a cold February afternoon, police receive a 911 call that shatters the innocence of this close-knit community forever.
I'll never forget the 911 call. It came in at about 1:40 p.m., and the dispatcher said that there was a shooting at the O'Connell Funeral Home. There are two bodies that have been shot.
The response from law enforcement is swift. Police, ambulances, helicopters
Coming to assist because this is a type of call that nobody ever heard over the police radio. It'd been 25 years since we had a homicide in Hudson. This was something totally new to us. We weren't expecting it.
Detectives find the bodies of 39-year-old Dan O'Connell, a funeral home director, and 22-year-old James Ellison, his intern.
Dan O'Connell was one of the most friendly, outgoing, energetic, loving people you could ever meet. He was involved in everything. He was a former North Hudson Pepper King. Everybody loved Dan O'Connell.
My soulmate, the love of my life. We were the best of friends. Besides being lifelong partners and parents, he was just always compassionate. He could make everybody feel comfortable.
James Ellison was a 22-year-old student who always dreamed about being a funeral director. James had a longtime girlfriend, high school sweetheart, and they had planned on getting married. And he picked O'Connell Funeral Home because he thought, hey, I want to learn from the best.
Tasked with solving the brutal double homicide of Dan O'Connell and James Ellison is rookie detective
Balance my emotions with what I need to get done. In my mind, this is a close personal friend that's murdered. It's time to take a deep breath and look at the big picture. I have to fix this somehow. I owe the family.
Detectives begin their investigation by surveying the crime scene.
Dan is an obvious bullet hole to his head. And next to him is James, hunched over, and he's bleeding, and I can just see the blood pouring out of his head. Obviously deceased as well. Both of them, their colors were gone. I've seen a lot of gunshot wounds, but this was different.
Investigators look for clues to help establish the time of death and a possible motive.
Because the blood was still running down the walls, we knew that this was a relatively fresh crime. We received the call at 1:40 p.m., and we determined that it probably happened within the past 2 hours, so somewhere between 11:40 a.m. and 1:40 p.m. The first question I asked myself was, is this a robbery that went bad? There was nothing that appeared out of place in there, no signs of a struggle, and James clearly had his wallet in his left pocket. It was in plain view. So in my mind, I'm thinking, this is something far beyond a robbery gone bad. The bullets were recovered and sent to a crime lab, and we determined that it came from a 9mm weapon. The shell casings that were found on the ground actually told us a lot about the crime scene. We believe that our killer is pushing up, getting up off the chair, probably gonna say, no, wait a minute. Suspect's got a gun and fires one and hits him right in the head. It appeared that James walked in, saw Dan deceased, and started walking behind the desk over to see him. Then all of a sudden he hears a gunshot, and he dropped his papers and went into a defensive mode. And that's when the third shot came, hit him in the pinky, when Dan was shot first and was most likely the original target. James just happened to be an innocent bystander, and he had to be killed because he was a witness. Whoever did this went right in with the sole purpose that I'm gonna kill Dan. He didn't have a chance to defend himself. He didn't have a chance to say anything. He just was murdered, point blank.
To catch Dan's killer, detectives will need to unravel the final 24 hours of his life.
Is somebody that angry that they're gonna kill him?
The first person detectives look at is Dan's widow, Jenny.
One of the toughest things for me is to have to go and ask a lot of the hard questions. I know I have to get personal with Jenny. I need to find out what's going on. What do you know? Are you involved?
Everyone knows that the first person you think of is the spouse. You know, that's who did it. And so I knew that I was #1 suspect.
I had to ask Jenny, was there any extramarital? But we had to find out. She said they were happily married, in love. Then I asked her about the life insurance policies. Is she gonna benefit hugely with Dan being gone? Is there a motive for her to want him dead? People do things for money. Money talks. It's the power of greed. But she said that life insurance policy was not an extensive amount, nor was it to be paid out immediately. So we didn't believe it was a life insurance issue.
Were killed.
This starts the timeline for me. Jenny said that about 7:40 a.m. Dan left for a meeting in Baldwin, Wisconsin. Jenny stayed home until she brought the kids to school about 8 o'clock to 8:15. Because her son's birthday was coming up, she spent the entire morning and afternoon preparing the house for the guests for the birthday party. She told me that she received a phone call from a friend advising her that there was some type of incident at the funeral home. She immediately stopped what she was doing and drove directly to the funeral home. She was where she said she was.
With Jenny ruled out as a suspect, detectives ask if she knows of anyone who would want to hurt Dan.
I racked my brains because nobody disliked him. Nobody talked bad about him. I had no scenarios going through my head. I had no clue.
Working to fill out Dan's timeline, detectives asked Jenny where Dan was going when he left the house the morning of his death. She tells them he was headed to a meeting with his business partner and brother, Mike.
Now that we've cleared Jenny, we have to take a look at Mike. Mike is operating, arguing. Are they complaining? Is there any kind of hardship between the two of them? Mike agrees to meet in my office, and I ask him, is there any kind of problems between you guys? Mike informed me that both funeral homes were doing very well. There was no financial hardships on either Dan or Mike. In fact, knowing both of them, you couldn't find a closer combination of brothers there. Those two were as tight as a drum.
Detectives asked Mike where he was during the critical time they believe Dan and James were killed.
Mike and Dan were together and Mike got back to the funeral home in Baldwin about 11:30 a.m., which was confirmed by his secretary. We know that Mike stayed at the funeral home from 11:30 until the time he was notified of the shooting.
With Mike ruled out as a person of interest, detectives turned back to the crime scene, looking for new clues.
We find a calendar in the office, and what was unique about it was there was an appointment at 1 o'clock that Dan had, for whatever reason, bumped back to 2 o'clock. So what is so important that he had to bump that he has to get taken care of right away? Now we need to figure out who Dan was meeting at 1 o'clock, because that is more than likely our killer.
Detectives are working the theory that the person Dan O'Connell had a 1 p.m. appointment with on the day he was murdered could be his killer. In an attempt to find out who that is, they interview his colleagues.
Father Ryan Erickson was one of the priests at St. Pat's, and because of the funeral home business, they had a working and personal relationship with Ryan Erickson.
Investigators hope that Father Erickson can help them figure out who Dan's 1 p.m. appointment was with.
Father Erickson knew Dan very well. He considered him a friend. They worked a lot of funerals together. I asked him, hey, what do you think happened? Tell me what you know.
Then I heard rumors too. Again, these are rumors, you both go out there married with Brock.
Father Erickson suggests that Dan might be having an affair with his secretary, Bonnie.
Dan and Bonnie worked very close together. They did a lot together. There were conferences that the two had to attend. So we need to look, hey, is there an affair going on here? Could Bonnie's husband, Dwayne, be involved? Did he find something out?
Working the theory that Dan O'Connell may have been killed by a jealous husband, detectives bring Dwayne down to the station for
hiding something, that he knew more. I asked Dwayne if he was a jealous husband. He said he did not like the fact that Bonnie had to go to these events with Dan. He thought, you know what, Dan, go by yourself. She needs to be home with the family, with the kids, with me. So he had a little bit of jealousy that she was going on these events with Dan.
Suspicious of Dwayne, they ask him for his alibi on the day Dan was killed.
He's a dairy farmer. And he said, just like every other morning, I get up and I start about 12 o'clock. He borrowed a friend's truck to run to a supply store. We were able to confirm the fact that he did borrow the truck, and he did return it at approximately 1 o'clock p.m.
Dwayne says he then stayed on the farm because he had a meeting scheduled there at 2 o'clock.
So now we know that he dropped the truck off at 1 o'clock and had a meeting at 2 o'clock. So that gives him a 1-hour window to kill Dan. We know that the homicides occurred somewhere before 1:40 p.m. It's 30 minutes for him to drive from Baldwin to Hudson, kill 2 people, get back in his vehicle, and get back in the time frame that is basically unaccounted for. We now have to rule Dwayne out because of the time frame. And now we start over from square one. Where do we go from here? We have nothing, absolutely nothing.
With the investigation hitting a wall, detectives examine the victim's phone records, looking for new clues.
At 1:07, Dan calls an engraving company. Then at 1:22, a call is placed to James's cell phone, but it goes unanswered. So somewhere between 1:07 and 1:22 is what we believe was the time of the crime.
Having narrowed down Dan's time of death to between 1:07 and 1:22 p.m., investigators attend his funeral, looking for new leads that could point to his killer.
I've always advocated that police investigators attend the funeral discreetly because often their behavior will give them away. They're either too over the top or they're too underwhelmed. Either way, it will stand out and will help you narrow your suspect pool.
The funeral was held in the Catholic Church, and it was standing room only. Hundreds of people standing outside of the church.
It was just amazing how many people came. It was just breathtaking that he had touched that many people. And people would say, you met Dan O'Connell once, you're his best friend for life. That's how he made you feel.
Eyes and ears open because this case isn't solved. We have nobody. We actually had undercover officers canvass the area, and we ran license plate checks on every single vehicle. Hundreds of vehicles.
But investigators leave the funeral empty-handed.
We have no leads. It's gonna go cold. And the frustrating part is, I'm not ready to be done, but I don't have anywhere else to go.
As the case stalls, the FBI contacts the Hudson Police Department.
A call from the FBI stating that there's a religious group about an hour and a half east of Hudson called the Rest of Jesus Ministries. And it's kind of a radical group that is against the embalming of bodies. The Rest of Jesus Ministries believed that the body should be wrapped in a shroud and shown as is.
When detectives look into the organization, they learn something alarming.
They sent out over 400 letters to funeral homes in the community or in the area. And in a letter, they threatened death.
Based upon that pamphlet,
This changes everything.
Detectives are working a new theory that a religious cult may have targeted funeral home director Dan O'Connell for betraying their beliefs.
the letters appeared threatening in nature, and that is a red flag to me.
Pickling of the body by the draining of the blood is an abomination to me, and this practice must cease. Failure to comply will bring a judgment of...
When I read that letter, I'm thinking this is a radical group that would do almost anything to get their point across. They distributed over 400 pamphlets to various funeral homes, and our department wanted to know if the Hudson Funeral Home, and in particular Dan O'Connell, received a letter from the Rest of Jesus Ministries.
Detectives run a background check on the group's leader, Catherine Padilla.
we found out that she had been arrested twice for disorderly conduct and 2 counts of stalking. To me, she potentially has a motive to commit such crime based upon her past history.
We have this strange ideological fixation, even an obsession. She's part of this anti-embalming cult, and then she has a history of stalker-like behavior. Combine those things, you're talking about someone very obsessive, very committed, someone who can act then very dangerously.
Believing Catherine Padilla could be responsible for a double homicide, detectives traveled to Augusta, Wisconsin to interrogate her.
What we learned from her is that she is the prophet of approximately 25 people consisting of adults and children. She holds these little gatherings at her home. To me, that's very odd.
And oftentimes, cult leaders are very charismatic. They draw followers to them. They can influence them into doing what they want. In popular terms, we might call this brainwashing or mind control. But really what it is a coercive process where people manipulate and exploit others to do what they want. Sometimes that ends in violence.
When investigators confront Catherine with the threatening letters she sent to funeral directors, she has a quick answer.
She just said it was simply an expression of her religious belief, out of context.
Suspecting Catherine is lying to them, detectives carry out a search warrant of her home.
We did do a search warrant at Catherine's apartment and seized several documents, including a letter that said, "Prepare for war." As alarming as it sounds, we couldn't find anything to tie her to Dan O'Connell. We asked her where she was on the day of the homicide. She said she was at home giving a sermon. We were able to determine, based upon other interviews, that indeed her time was accounted for several hundred miles away from Hudson.
Waiting for this to come to a conclusion was the worst. It's the looking over your shoulder, you know. I mean, they're going to come after me and my kids. And looking at people differently. Who are my friends? Who can I trust? Do I know this person really? Do I really know who you are? Did you have anything to do with Dan's death? Did you do this? I became very enclosed. And I didn't trust anybody because I didn't know.
Deep down, I knew I had to do something. I had a personal interest in this now that I will work it until the day I die. If it means staying another 20 years on the force, we're going to get to the bottom of it.
After 2 years, the families of Dan O'Connell and James Ellison fear their murders may never be solved. Dan's family decides to take matters into their own hands.
Kathy O'Connell, the sister to Dan, reached out to a group of retired homicide detectives presenting our case to the VDOC Society, hoping for an answer.
This is precisely what we do, is offer advice and direction and peer review for free on stalled investigations. In many cases, it's just about getting a set of fresh eyes with no existing sort of presumptions or biases to look at something objectively, and you'd be amazed what the results can be.
Richard Walter, a criminal profiler and one of the Society's founding members, agrees to take a look at the case.
Mr. Walter was able to paint a better picture of the crime scene for us. First of all, the shooter was detached from the victims. He wanted to show power over the victims. This is not an anger retaliatory, a jealous husband, angry co-worker type of situation. You didn't see that multiple shots to the body. You didn't see signs of overkill. This was a power-assertive, cold and calculated killing.
Detective Petit and Richard Walter start from the beginning. digging into the background of all of Dan's close friends and colleagues.
Of the top 10 persons of interest, could not rule out completely, and that was Ryan Erickson.
Detectives look deeper into Father Erickson's background and discover something alarming.
We learned before he came to Hudson that a college student reported that he had been provided alcohol while he was underage, and that he had been sexually assaulted by Father Ryan Erickson. Just because he's doing these sexual assaults doesn't mean he's a killer, but it gives us an idea of his mental state. If he's committing this type of crime,
Detectives track Father Erickson down at the parish, and he agrees to come into the station for an interview.
we question him about his actions regarding these sex assaults and the consequences of underage alcohol consumption.
How often did you have him drink with you?
I think maybe 3 or 4 times.
Did he ever become highly intoxicated and get sick?
He did.
Tell me about that.
Well, he got sick, and so I went and I put him into the shower, took his clothes and got his clothes washed, and then brought him back.
Stating that he was just trying to teach these kids a lesson on how to drink and how to consume alcohol responsible.
Why would you provide alcohol to somebody underage?
It's what, I mean, that's what they, when I grew up, that's the kind of thing we did. We had alcohol. It was okay to have that kind of thing. So I've never had that it's evil or bad kind of idea to it.
I'm talking legally.
Yeah, I know.
We have statutes.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay.
Yeah, I did wrong. Yeah.
Who in the right mind would be even remotely saying that they're trying to We need to find out where Father Ryan Erickson was on February 5th, 2002, the day Dan and James were killed. He stated at 8:00 a.m. he conducted Mass. Between 11:30 and 12:30, he had lunch at the school with the children. And between 12:30 and 1:30, he went back to the church to work on his computer.
This information is important because if it's true and accurate, it shows that he was not at the scene. And so if he has an alibi here, it's important information.
I heard that he was shot at his desk. And James, I heard, was shot in a doorway.
Do you recall where you heard this from?
You know, I'm not exactly positive, no.
And he stated that he read it in the newspaper or heard it on the news or something to that effect.
In the course of this investigation, never once has anybody from the Hudson Police Department ever mentioned where the bodies were, positions, etc. Nor in the course of this speculation, a probability, a possibility, or anything like that as far as where the bodies were. Nor has anybody told us how many times they were shot or where they were shot. If that hasn't been brought up in 1,900 some interviews, and out of the course of 5 people in our department that knew exactly that, and not even he knows where that was, why do you know that?
I don't know why I know that.
Or why are you giving us information that this is what you heard?
Well, this is what I have heard. If you ask me a question, I tell you the answer.
That was a huge red flag for me because he just explained in detail the crime scene. That information was never, ever released to the public. The only person that would know this information is the shooter.
After revealing details about the murders of funeral home director Dan O'Connell and his intern James Ellison that only the killer would know, detectives zero in on Father Ryan Erickson as their prime suspect in the 2002 double homicide.
For what you're none of that was broadcast.
This is the very first we've ever heard of it.
If you're given direct things, Ryan,
I don't know.
Why?
All I know is I may have overheard that.
You're giving us information that was never, ever released to the public. You have told us exactly what happened in the funeral home. However, he still denies it.
did you kill Dan?
I did not kill Dan.
Did you want to kill him?
No, I did not. I have no reason to want to kill Dan O'Connell.
One of the last questions I asked him,
If I did it, and I've been living with it for this long, and you guys had me cornered here, I'd break. I'd tell you. I know I would. And the reason is because I think the guilt would be so overwhelming. I really do.
If you could get away with it, would you tell us?
No. Yeah, I mean, if I could get away with it?
Yes.
Probably no. I mean, I'd try to get away with it. Human nature says you try to get away with it.
and I said, if you committed these homicides and knew you were going to get caught, what would you do?
You know, I've thought about suicide before. You know, if I did something that heinous, I'd tell you what, I think I'd be thinking about it now.
My reaction when he said he would commit suicide if he was going to get caught was overwhelming. I mean, that's a sin in itself to commit suicide in the eyes of the Catholic Church.
Investigators now have enough circumstantial evidence to request a search warrant.
So we end up conducting a search warrant at his house, and we seize his computer. We found several images of child sex assaults. We located a software device that he put on his computer in an attempt to wipe the hard drive. We located those were sent to the crime lab.
When detectives dig deeper into Father Erickson's computer, it reveals a key piece of evidence.
There was no activity on his computer between 12:30 and 1:30, like he said. We have to wonder now if between 1:07 and 1:22 p.m., Ryan Erickson killed Dan and James.
Having destroyed Father Erickson's alibi, detectives worked to figure out why he would want Dan O'Connell, the town's beloved funeral director, dead. Their questions are answered.
The bus driver at one of the local stores, and according to her, Dan told her that he had a meeting with Father Erickson later on that day. Dan was concerned about Father Erickson and about his relationship with boys and allegations of touching and that type of thing, which would give us a motive.
Detectives now theorize that Father Erickson was the mysterious 1 p.m. meeting that Dan had booked last minute on the day he was murdered.
Clearly, Dan knew something about Ryan Erickson that he didn't want let out.
Into the police.
Detectives race to the rectory to arrest Father Erickson. They are met by his superior, Deacon Russ Lundgren.
He advised that Ryan Erickson put a rope around his neck, tied it to the balcony, and jumped off and committed suicide. Russ Lundgren found a couple letters on Ryan Erickson's desk. One of them was the last will and testament, and the other was a letter just stating he didn't do it.
I've lived a hard but exciting life, but I never killed anyone. My ego, my pride, my lust, my envy have always stopped me from being the best person I could be. I am tired.
In this note, he talks about certain characteristics in himself that he's not happy with, even though he denies doing the crime. I see this as kind of a shame-anger cycle, where you blame other people, but then when you have nobody else to blame, you end up blaming yourself.
But what Deacon Lundgren tells detectives next confirms their deepest suspicions.
A few days desk, and said, I did it and they're gonna get me. And Lundgren peeked his head in the office and said, what are you talking about? And he said, you know what they do to priests in prison? That statement alone is a confession. There's no doubt in my mind that Ryan Erickson killed Dan O'Connell and James Ellison.
Detectives now believe they know what happened in the final hours of Dan O'Connell's life.
He left his home at 7:40 a.m. and met with his brother Mike in Baldwin about 8 o'clock, 9:30. Dan told the bus driver that he had a meeting with Erickson between 12:30 and 1:30. At 1:07, Dan calls an engraving company. Sometime between 1:07 and 1:22, Father Ryan Erickson is in the funeral home. He pulled the trigger, killed Dan O'Connell in cold blood. And as he's getting ready to leave, James Ellison just happens to walk through that doorway. And now we have a witness. James.
When detectives tell Jenny that they believe Father Erickson killed her husband and his intern, she's in disbelief.
It shocked the hell out of me because that man was in my house hours after he shot and killed Dan and James. He consoled me and my family. He spoke at Dan's funeral, and that was almost as bad as the day that Dan, he took away my faith in my Catholic Church, and I felt I didn't know anybody. If he could shoot two men in cold blood and go about his life as if nothing happened.
St. Croix County District Attorney Eric Johnson requests a John Doe hearing.
A John Doe hearing is something similar to a grand jury hearing, except for it will not result in charges coming, but it will show that there was a sufficient amount of evidence to find the
person was the likely killer.
His findings were that we not only showed probable cause that Father Erickson killed Dan and Jim, but also beyond a reasonable doubt.
The judge came back and said, on a scale of 1 to 10, this case is a 10 out of 10.
He did it. He would have been guilty. And I was like, okay, now it's over. That was closure. I could shut that chapter finally in my life and open up a new one, because it was done.
Detectives are finally able to bring closure to the families of both Dan O'Connell and James Ellison.
It felt like a big weight was lifted off my shoulder, because I know it affected my family. I know it affected the victims. It was just a huge sense of relief that what took 2 years seemed like it took 10.
But the scars still remain after all these years.
I think of all the time, it's the learning how to drive, going to prom, graduating from high school. He's just missed out on a lot. But we're survivors. And the kids and I, we talk about that a lot. There's nothing we can't survive because we've been to hell and back already.